Okay, what is going on? Dylan Conrad, Metabolic AF. Today I'm joined with Ali Miller. She's an integrative dietitian. She's the host of the Naturally Nourished podcast, and she's the author of the Anti-Anxiety Diet. Ali, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited for a fun conversation.
Same. So maybe we can start by telling us a little bit about more about yourself that wasn't in that little intro, just kind of how you got started and how you ended up here.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'm an integrative dietitian. I went to a
Hmm.
naturopathic college of medicine, Bastyr University,
Hmm.
and I moved to Texas from my studies in Washington for the medical center. Did my year of grind work, worked for a general practitioner who was double board pediatrician and general practitioner. And for
Hmm.
3 years, I was the director of her integrative program, where I
Mm.
was given 6 to 12 weeks to work with her patients with dysmetabolic syndrome to prevent them
Mm.
from going on a statin drug or metformin at a time of a new diabetes diagnosis, et cetera. And very quickly, she learned that functional nutrition can expand beyond metabolic disease into the world of autoimmune conditions, gut
Yeah.
diagnoses, and so much
Yeah.
more. And one of my patients was a producer at ABC. And so she
Hmm.
played a huge role in my career trajectory. In 2012, I started
Oh,
doing
cool.
TV segments on food as medicine
Hmm.
because I was able to get her off of her hypertensive drug, her diabetic
Hmm.
drug, and her
Hmm.
Lipitor, all from using food as medicine and targeted nutritional supplements. And so I opened my own
That's
clinic
great.
in 2012, and the rest has been history.
Here we are. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit more about metabolic syndrome. Obviously, the people listening might not know what that is and kind of maybe how it affects the body.
Yeah, so in the mid 2000s, this diagnosis of dysmetabolic syndrome X was this
Hmm.
new diagnosis that hit,
Yeah.
and it really encompasses the triad of blood pressure issues, so
Hmm.
hypertension,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
diabetes or hyperglycemia or elevated glucose
Yeah.
levels, with insulin resistance often as the first
Right.
presentation. And then there are markers of centralized obesity. So waist circumference
Hmm.
plays a role in the diagnoses. And then as does dyslipidemia or imbalances in lipids. And that's pretty standard, those five criteria factors in, how a general practitioner, your go-to doctor, is going to diagnose. Now, of course, the approach in a functional integrative is going to be different. And even the diagnosis is going to be different because we look at different ranges.
Hmm.
We tend to not just jump on a dumbed down lipid panel. We look at way more complex assessments of cardiovascular risk and so much more. And we use different intervention points, of course, versus blocking pathways in the body with medication.
Right. And so in terms of like the ranges, obviously you're more of integrative dietitian, right? Versus someone who is just like a doctor. I always hear about oh, they just use whatever ranges and, our ranges are more like specific. What's the difference and why does that even matter?
Well, so reference ranges are determined by the health of the population. So
Hmm.
we have a very unhealthy population. So to
Yeah.
be in a normal reference range is not the goal. That's
Right.
why I always speak with my clients about, it's like,
Hmm.
so yeah, and that's the problem is when you go to your conventional doc, they'll say, oh, well, your labs look normal. And a
Right.
lot, especially a lot of women, are really lamped in the medical industry complex. And they're either told to go on an anxiolytic or anxiety reducing drug or an antidepressant or put right away on Synthroid, even though their thyroid labs are normal.
Right.
And so we're just masking these problems and not really looking at understanding what the body's trying to tell us by
Yeah.
running more sensitive panels or more what I would call like upstream analytes, for instance. Your
Yeah.
A1C, which is that
Hmm.
3-month average of blood sugar, your A1C can look
Hmm.
normal for years. But if you test your fasting insulin level, that may show an elevation preceding that A1C coming up. And so a lot of things are just not assessed if there isn't a medication to address the problem. And so another example of that is in the standard medical model that in the industry I was in prior to my private practice, I would always
Yeah.
advocate for a marker called homocysteine. Homocysteine is a marker of methylation, basically. So this will get nerdy for a second, but we'll pull it out of the woods.
Nerd it up.
Okay, so methylation is a process of building or excreting in the functional medicine world back really a decade and a half ago. This is not anything new. The world of MTHFR and genetics and how these can play a role in neurotransmitter production,
Mhm,
detoxification,
mhm.
various
Yeah.
neurological conditions, et cetera. And now many people know, now a lot more people are coming to light of knowing and testing that gene in particular. Well, anyway,
Yeah.
homocysteine is a marker of vascular inflammation. And if homocysteine
Mm.
levels are elevated, the vessels are more rigid. And we know also that homocysteine elevation trends to someone that has MTHFR defect or that genetic mutation. And so there's no drug that can bring homocysteine levels down, but there are methyl donor nutrients or methylating nutrients that actually can convert that homocysteine back into methionine, biochemically speaking, and correct that issue. But there's no pharmaceutical drug. And so what happens is doctors get in these pits of, okay, well, maybe I read that that's an interesting factor, but why would I track homocysteine on a patient if I don't have a tool or something to modulate or impact that level, if that makes sense. But
Yeah.
on a functional nutritional level, we can track and watch homocysteine levels reduced by 30% every, 8 weeks by following a particular protocol.
Right. So it is able to kind of adapt. And speaking of which, like, we talk about all these things, metabolic syndrome and, all these other issues that we're seeing, obviously using the population as a reference, which is unhealthy population, right? In the majority of us. How much does this just boil down to like shitty habits?
I mean, a lot, and I don't think I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't word it that. I understand we're going there, but I think
Mhm.
what it boils down to is disempowerment on a larger scale that has been strategically funded to
Mhm.
manipulate us into shitty habits, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah.
I think that it's been in a long-term plan to get people out of cooking, reduce the home gardens, create this convenience equals freedom complex,
Right.
when really all of these convenient foods and the industrialized food model,
Yeah.
which is heavily supported by the industrialized medical model, are really tied to create forever patients. And
Mhm.
so I think that there's too many billions of dollars behind it and too many food scientists and too many medical colleges,
Yeah.
honestly, and funding to say that it's shitty habits. I think that it's been a multi-marketed campaign preceding pandemic, and we're just starting to see the juxtaposition or the influence now, really, in the
Yeah.
last 5 years.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's very interesting. I didn't really think about it from that angle. We are in like a very obesogenic, as Peter Attia puts it, society.
Yep.
Like everything
Yep.
is very easy. It's very easy to, gain weight and be unhealthy. And we have a lot of access, quick access to, things that are not the healthiest for us.
Right.
With that said, like, are there some habits that you work with your clients on to like really kind of build up their, I guess, vitality?
Well, I mean, the first important thing is when you're using food as medicine, you have to be using whole real foods. And
Mhm.
so, of course, educating them on what is a product,
Mhm.
uh, even in the natural food realm,
Yeah.
what I call chemical shitstorm versus a real food is the first step. And
Yeah.
then once you're eating whole real foods, it's important to consider at the same time, you're sourcing and understanding connecting your food security with voting with your dollar with your ranchers and growers
Right.
directly and or
Right.
having an intimate role yourself. if you want nutrient density in your food selection.
Hmm.
And I think equally to that is understanding macronutrients. And, blood sugar balance is I'm also a certified diabetes educator. So
Yeah.
I can do anything and I can go in which is really fun. I mean, that's the fun nuance of being a registered dietitian, is that I get to kind of balance the banks of conventional medicine. So I can work with the endocrinologist, the gastroenterologist, et cetera. But then I also have my bank totally in the naturopathic world. And
Hmm.
as long as these allopathic docs are seeing outcomes, they're pretty
Yeah.
open and receptive. And so, they may not understand the role of glycine and methylfolate in that homocysteine reduction, but they know that that value is reducing when they work with me.
Right.
And so when we work with macronutrients, all that to say is that preceding any issues with diabetic complications, I work with a low glycemic diet and often a ketogenic diet in 90% of my population, and not tight keto, a real food metabolic flexibility form of keto. And that's the foundation of my anti-anxiety diet. That's the foundation of Naturally Nourished. I believe very strongly that our body was designed to be a hybrid machine, to use both ketones and glucose.
Hmm.
And when we regulate our glucose levels, there is less oxidative stress, there is less
Yeah.
inflammation, and the body just
Hmm.
functions better.
Yeah. And speaking of which, you're talking about keto, what, like, because I've heard people talk about, okay, keto is just very low carb, and then other people like, you have to be in ketosis. Like, how do you, I know you have more of like a flexible, but I mean, maybe you can tell us about your approach versus like the traditional keto approach.
Yeah, so everything is N equals 1 or individualized, right? And so
Hmm.
it depends on how metabolically handicapped you are, is the answer of how strict you have to be to get into a metabolically flexible mode. So
Okay.
the more metabolically handicapped you are, by meaning more body fat, more
Hmm.
elevated fasting glucose levels, which are indicator of a metabolic issue,
Yeah.
elevated fasting insulin, any
Hmm.
markers of dysglycemia,
Yeah.
you're going to have to go tighter carb control and more of an aggressive ketogenic start, if you will, to teach your body to use fat as fuel,
Okay.
to reduce that insulin level, to get you into the ability to then expand the diet. Children, for instance, we hope. Um, I mean, it's a wild world, and again, type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset,
Yeah.
and juvenile diabetes was type
Yeah.
1. But
Yeah.
now, the 4-year-olds are being diagnosed in this country with type 2 diabetes, which is just an absolute assault to the children. But we hope, and generally speaking, children that are breastfed and that are especially doing more of a baby-led weaning, meaning eating
Hmm.
whole real foods, not squeeze pouches, which are lighter fluid for their blood sugar.
Hmm.
If they're eating whole real foods and transitioning from breast milk to whole real foods, they should be in a state of metabolic flexibility where it's really just focusing on pairing those children's carbs with protein or fat. So if they're doing grapes, you're not giving them an unlimited bag of grapes or 2 cups of grapes. They're having maybe a half cup of grapes with some raw aged cheddar, with maybe some quality
Yeah.
meat of sort, right?
Yeah.
Or a jerky or a Chomps beef
Hmm.
stick or something like that. So for kiddos, generally they're more metabolically flexible, they're more
Yeah.
metabolically active. And
Hmm.
so you really just have to focus on carb pairing with kiddos, and they will start to make moderate to light amounts of ketones. And that's the sweet spot where you want to be. Now, for some adults that have been insulting their body for years with excessive refined processed
Yeah.
carbs, eating too frequent, they're going to need a solid 6 to 8 weeks of eating under 30 total grams of carbs
Hmm.
and intermittent fasting to retrain their body. And then we can start to tip into what I call phase
Got
1.5
it.
eating.
Okay.
And that's where then we break up with this mind space of that's not keto, that is keto. And that's where I think a lot of people get pigeonholed. Banana isn't keto. Sweet potato isn't keto. And my point is, if you're making ketones, guess
You're
what?
in
That's
keto. Yeah, you're
keto.
keto. It's funny because that's why I asked that question because I always talk to people like, "Oh, I did keto," and I'm like, "Okay, like, did you really do keto? Like, did you like pee on the sticks and all that stuff? Or you just
Right.
like low eating like whatever a VLCD, right? Like a low carbohydrate diet?" So 20 to 30 grams of carbs, that is what I've heard in terms of, and I know you mentioned that number. Is that
Mhm.
kind of like in the beginning when you have to be more aggressive with that,
Right.
getting into ketosis? That's kind of like the carbs that you see to stay under are best, or yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
generally speaking. And we do advocate for testing ketones, absolutely, because
Yeah.
that's what the beauty of the diet is that
Hmm.
it's the only diet where your body makes a biochemical substrate that
Yeah.
has therapeutic effects
Yeah.
based on the implementation of the diet
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah.
Nothing else out there does that.
Yeah.
And ketones cross the blood-brain barrier and have a multitude of benefits that we can nerd out on in a minute. But yes, doing a very low calorie or a very low carbohydrate diet on its own does not mean you're producing ketones. There are various
Yeah.
limiting factors. So,
Hmm.
for some individuals, for instance, we have to check into their adrenals because they might have insufficient DHEA.
Right.
DHEA goes through a metabolic process of 7 keto DHEA to make ketones. So, if you are a perimenopausal woman or a high stressed younger woman or a man that just has low T, chances are you also have low DHEA.
Hmm.
And that itself, you would have to supplement with to get above 150 to even produce ketones.
Is that
Carnitine,
because, oh, sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna ask, is that because menopausal women and overweight men are more insulin resistant, so that DHEA, that's where it kind of comes into play, or is it multiple things?
Multiple things,
Okay.
but DHEA is a stress responding compound. It's a steroidal hormone made by the adrenal
Right.
glands. We usually talk about cortisol, but DHEA is made in the same part, the
Hmm.
cortex of the adrenal gland, and it is a
Hmm.
precursor to estrogen and testosterone.
Yeah.
So we tend to think when hormone decline or hormone change is occurring, that that's a more poignant time of stress to that production pathway, if you will.
Got it. Hmm.
But again, individuals that are just high stressed might be insufficient as well.
Right.
And
Okay.
then I was
That's
going to mention
interesting.
carnitine.
Mm-hmm.
Carnitine's an amino acid,
Mm-hmm.
and there's an entire biochemical shuttle in the body of how we oxidize fat, which is a process that occurs to make ketones.
Yeah.
And that carnitine synthase shuttle requires this particular amino acid to produce ketones and fuel the mitochondria. If you're deficient in carnitine, which can happen from over exercising or muscle wasting without having ample amino acid repletion, or people that just don't eat enough protein, especially
Hmm.
in the red meat family, maybe
Yeah.
they heard red meat was bad for them. They're going to have a hard time making ketones as well. And so that's something that if we're not seeing the data, we'll supplement with 2 grams a day of carnitine and see if that gets them leveled up. So there's a lot of strategy because you're actually trying to make a biochemical substrate.
So I take it you're a big fan of carnitine.
I am, but I'm not like a. I mean, I'm a big fan of whatever the body needs at
Yeah, yeah,
whatever time
yeah.
it
Well, my
needs,
point
right?
is,
Like I
it's
don't
funny
give it to
because like,
everyone.
yeah, because like I don't know if you've have you heard of the book The Carnitine Miracle? Robert Crayon, he wrote it in like I think it was like 2006 or 2008, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But that
No.
was the first time I heard about carnitine. And
Okay.
I was like, oh,
Okay.
wow, this is like, it does so much stuff. It's like, because I'm a big fan of carnitine. So I was like, oh, you
Mhm.
big. But yeah, I get that's like, obviously, it's N equals one, right? It's like,
Yeah.
it has to be customized to that person. I wanted to backtrack a little bit because you were talking about, I have a 4-year-old and getting her to eat these foods. And my wife didn't breastfeed, and
Uh-huh.
so like, what I'm sure you work with a lot of parents, or maybe you're a parent yourself. Like, how do you kind of, maybe for women that can't breastfeed, or that they're having a hard time like integrating these good foods to, like, how do you recommend, or what are some things you try to work
Yeah.
with them on?
Well, so I am coming out with my fourth book,
Let's
Naturally
go.
Nourished Kids. So it's right on topic with that.
Yeah.
And I'm super excited to hopefully release that in the fall of 2024. And
Yeah.
that's the answer to the problem of, child obesity, ADHD,
Hmm.
and the whole array of neurological conditions as well as
Yeah.
diabetes for children. And so we have so many amazing recipes that we're developing and shooting and getting ready for that release. It comes down to modeling,
Mhm.
and children are absolute sponges and they watch everything that you do all the time. And so it's really important that you model the same behaviors that you expect of them.
Yeah.
Having consistent dining times and rituals and not spoiling their meals by allowing grazing. I'm very
Mhm.
anti grazing for children. I think
Yeah.
that that's a cultural, new adaptation just from our fast food, hyper processed food industry. You
Yeah.
don't need a snack pack everywhere that the child is. The child does
Mhm.
not need to eat more than 3 to 4 times a day, and if they do, that means that they have some hypoglycemic trends that you need to correct with nourishment.
Yeah.
And so I'm not a fan of grazing, I'm not a fan of frequent snacking. I'm a fan of presenting protein, and vegetable first and fruit halfway through the meal to stimulate the continued eating process,
Smart.
and protein first for sure. Yep.
Yeah.
And teaching at early as age 2. I mean,
Mhm.
early as age 1, when they're sitting up in their high chair and they're playing with the baby led weaning solids, of identifying foods and identifying those categories of foods
Yeah.
so that you can support autonomy and choice. Every child wants to be heard and honored. And when you say specifically, it's a poor choice as a parent to say, "What do you want for dinner?" My daughter's name is Stella. Stella, what do you want for dinner? Is a very poor choice. The choice is for protein,
That's so
we
nice.
have
Yeah.
chicken thighs or
Yeah.
wild salmon. What
Yeah.
would you prefer as your protein choice?
Mhm.
And then she selects one. And then we say, okay. And then sometimes we don't give a choice in every category because I'm just making sheet pan broccoli or I'm
Yeah.
just making a salad, whatever.
Right.
But I always give her a category of choice. And same with packing the lunches, trying
Yeah.
to bring them in on the process. Child knives are awesome, as much as you can bring them into harvesting from your garden and the whole picture. I mean, as early as age 2 and 3, my daughter, we identified at grocery stores. Oh yeah, that Paw Patrol, that Frozen, that's marketing, baby, and they're trying to trick you to eat things that aren't food. That's how I explained it to her, and it's
Yeah.
facts.
Yeah.
You watch your cartoons on a show, I will get you a lunch box with them, or maybe we will find a sticker to put on your stainless steel water bottle if that's the part of the cultural norm that you want to participate in.
Mhm.
But we're not going to put trash in our bodies. That's not
Yeah.
what we do.
No, that's those are all. I mean, I'm sure everyone listening to that's like, oh, that's like gold right there. That's so helpful. Um,
Or
in
intense,
terms, what was that?
or too intense, but it just is what it
No,
is.
I mean, you're obviously no, you're very passionate about it, and it shows through. I was just gonna ask about you were talking about macros a while ago. Now,
Mhm.
with your clients, is that something you have some people track, or is it like just like, okay, I want to make sure that you are getting enough protein and obviously the carbs are staying lower and all that stuff.
It depends on your goals. So, if you are doing my eating plan for mental health, I may
Mhm.
not have you track, because that can often drive a little
Drive
bit
you
more
insane.
nursing. Yes, yes. So, I might want to keep you, especially the
Yeah,
anti-anxiety diet, try to keep it very conceptual,
totally.
in that approach. But again, still keto, still phasic, still understanding the metabolic flexibility.
Yeah.
If you're doing macros, particularly for muscle gains or for body fat loss, you 100,000,000% have to track.
Yeah.
Because I always say, we can't say it's not working if we don't know you're doing it. Right. So, like, I could prescribe the perfect macros, 90 to 120 grams of protein, 70 to 90 grams of fat,
Yeah.
40 to 60 grams of carbs, and lay that out in this
Mhm.
beautiful antioxidant rich, lovely grass fed protein distribution. But if they're not following that and then they say it doesn't work, we can't troubleshoot.
Yeah.
So I need them to track so I can say, well, here's the meals that are going too high in grams of fat. We need to pull that out because it's already a higher fat cut of meat. So you don't have to add the avocado there. Or don't do your fat fasted coffee on this
Yeah.
day if you're eating in this way because you've already met that threshold through these choices. And so the only way you can make modifiable change is through collecting information. And I think tracking is important as well. There's a lot of resistance to it, I understand, but it is empowering for the individual because it connects them to their body and
Yeah.
what they're actually doing. I mean, we're so
Mhm.
disconnected. And I think that that's a part of, I am absolutely about food freedom is my
Yeah.
endpoint goal, sustainability and food freedom. But
Amen.
until you track, once you track and you learn, oh, when I look at that plate, that's what this is, then you can't forget that
Yeah.
learned experience.
Yeah.
And then you don't need the calculator anymore. But
Totally.
initially, you do.
Yeah, and I feel like, I always tell my clients, and when people aren't into this program, like, we're gonna have you track food. I'm just gonna let you know this is not sustainable. Like, you should not be doing this
Yeah.
forever. But
Yes.
yeah, like you were saying, I feel like there's a really big psychological benefit to some people. No, not everyone, obviously, of actually tracking and seeing what is going into your body and really understanding like hunger cues and fullness cues and like, am I
Yes.
just eating to eat? And it's also like a lot of time. I think most people, we have cravings, right?
Mhm.
And if we have a craving, going for it, if we have to enter food in, that's like a wedge we can drive in between instead of like just going like craving to action, right? And
Yep.
so I feel like it's such a powerful tool. That's really interesting that you use it, because I know we were talking a lot about food freedom. And
Mhm.
on one side of the spectrum, I've always felt like you have the intuitive eaters and mindful eaters, and it's like food tracking is the devil. You're gonna get an eating disorder. You're a horrible human being. And on the other side, it's like, it's like, okay, good luck, like seeing results. And I feel like there
Right.
is a bridge between both, but it seems like you kind of do that bridge. How does that look like for some of your clients, maybe?
I mean, like you said, and like I said earlier, it's important to establish so you know the what, so you can
Yeah,
adjust why it's not
yeah,
working and come up with a new what or
yeah,
restructure the plan. And I think
yeah,
there's also confidence in food freedom some people like to anticipatory track, which I'm okay
yeah,
with in the
yeah,
beginning if it's like overburdening and it's not in their routine to
totally.
stop every time they eat. But
Right.
that can be helpful too because you can then troubleshoot in advance to stay within your goals. And
Yeah.
then you have like a gamut of 20 meals that you've memorized that work for your
Hmm.
macros. And
Yeah.
then you don't have to open the tracker. You just know this is one that's this. And so, again, I think connecting the dots to actual facts
Yeah.
then create something that is sustainable. And then when you're at a restaurant, you can mimic that type of meal,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah.
And so I think it's super empowering. And I think that um, the whole, I mean, there's this whole movement beyond that of disempowerment, I believe also of like
Yeah.
the All Foods Fit campaign.
Yeah.
Um, I've been hit really hard at like women's groups where I've been on a panel and they've said something about like Oreos, but like, there shouldn't be shame in Oreos. And I say, well, I don't believe that there should be shame associated with foods. But if you're asking me if there's a time and a place that Oreos belong in the human body, I'm going to have to say no. Um, like I'm going to have to say no. It's a
Yeah.
chemical shitstorm.
Right.
And I think it's disempowering to tell people that you should eat everything that the processed food industry puts out there because otherwise you might have an eating disorder.
Right.
I think that that's garbage. I think that that's
Mm.
garbage information.
Yeah. It's interesting you said, because like, yeah, I feel like I was talking to a woman, and she was talking about, like processed food, like they're like drug foods almost.
Right.
And it's like sometimes we just need to cut those out completely.
Mhm.
And it's funny you say that, because like I'm one of those people who is like, yeah, if you want to fit it in, like, as long as it's not too crazy, like what is kind of your, because obviously, yeah, from we're talking about perfect situation, like, yeah, the human
Sure.
body should not have processed food, like we shouldn't, right? But from like a lifestyle standpoint, if someone wants to have some alcohol, or maybe someone does want to have like an
Right.
occasional Oreo, like how bad is that for us?
So I guess I am a fan for sure of a mindful indulgence, and I
Yeah.
believe in the benefits of hormesis, which can be sometimes coming from something that's a suboptimal choice. And so hormesis is that process of stressing the body, right,
Okay.
to upregulate its internal production of often anti-inflammatory or
Yeah.
antioxidants.
Yeah.
And that's my argument of why we eat plants and don't worry about anti-nutrients in them. But that's its own point. In the world of like choices of rewards, if you will,
Yeah.
I think the world of alcohol has a good, better, best spectrum.
Right.
I think that alcohol has been consumed for hundreds of years, probably that, probably plus thousands. I
Yeah.
mean, biblical times, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so it's about the dose and the poison,
Hmm.
and what are you seeking that for, how frequently, is it celebratory and communal, and is there gain to that,
Yeah.
and the cleanest options possible, so like molecularly triple distilled Spirits often are going to be pretty
Yeah.
free of inflammatory compounds.
Right.
And then looking at traditional things like maybe like Sotol versus tequila, which is now predominantly corn,
Yeah.
or looking at Pinot Noir, which has the most resveratrol, or I like to recommend old world wines where there's not glyphosate as opposed to Californian wines.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just then getting nuanced of good, better, best choice.
Hmm.
And in the world of like sweet treats, I would just request it be made with whole foods. So,
Yeah.
you know, if it's a brownie that you want to make, okay. I'm not a fan of gluten-free flours because those are highly
Hmm.
processed as well.
Yeah.
You know, like a lot of the like cup for cup and whatnot, it's a lot of corn as filler and tapioca starch, etc. So it's like I'm a bigger fan of almond flour or hazelnut flour or
Right.
nut meals, et cetera. A little bit more nourishing, a little lower GI
Yeah.
glycemic index. And I think that you can make a lot of things. You can eat dark chocolate. You can melt the chocolate down and dip some strawberries. You know, there's again a good, better, best. And I
Yeah.
think it's just as we are in this continuum,
Hmm.
it becomes organic because when you connect to your body, you get feedback from your body.
Hmm.
And what used to be a deviant choice becomes less desirable the more you move your marker from mediocre to vacillating back and forth from mediocre to shitty is really easy. But
Yeah.
once you move from mediocre to health excellence or optimal health, there's not much that you'll desire to bounce back into that shitty realm. And
Right.
what used to maybe just shift you back to mediocrity
Yeah.
is now much more poignant.
Hmm.
And so it's easier to not eat the inflammatory chips and just eat the guac with a spoon or order
Yeah.
a ceviche, right?
So
Because that's nourishing.
so you're saying it's like you stop craving it or you stop really like wanting it once you're really like eating cleaner. Is that what you're saying? Or
I think so. You know, I mean,
yeah.
I used to back in the day run these 10-day detoxes. I still do. But it's so interesting just in my personal experience of 2 decades ago when I started this work of thinking about how like I'll look at my normal groceries at a natural food store and I'm like, "Oh, well this is my 10-day detox list, but this is just my norm now." And
Yeah.
now when I do a detox, it's a challenge to change things because it's just become more integrated with what I desire.
Interesting. And thank you for covering that and everything. I know we're kind of coming to the end. So you can we talk a little bit about because you have a supplement line, right?
I do. Yes,
So
I do.
how does that kind of like work? And is it more of like obviously you can't say I don't know if you can say prescriptive or not, but like is it like okay, you have this is what you need to take and da da da. Like how do you kind of do you match that up with blood work you do, or maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your
Sure. So it's a full spectrum supplement line,
Mhm.
and we have it broken down on my website with categories.
Yeah,
So that helps to navigate based on if
yeah,
you're looking to address inflammation, if you're looking to address stress and anxiety, women's hormones, or fertility. And so, kind of based on those categories, there's of course nutrients that are well researched to have a mechanism of action or an impact. So, for
yeah.
instance, like my GABA Calm Chews. This is
Oh,
a
I love
bio.
GABA. I
Yeah.
love
So
GABA. It's the
going back to
best.
cravings, right?
Yeah.
So it's a bioidentical GABA. It's actually fermented with the same strain that you use in
I think I
production of
copped some of that.
kimchi.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the same strain of lactobacteria that's made for
Mhm.
kimchi makes it bioidentical. It's a easy melt tablet. And so it crosses the blood brain barrier in about 10 to
Yeah.
15 minutes. And it's an
Nice.
inhibitory, right? So it's like
Yeah.
landing gear for your fight or flight
Yes.
bottleneck.
Yeah.
I chew it anytime before I'm on stage, if I'm doing a big presentation, because I have so much adrenaline surging that I don't want to have that shake or that
Yeah.
tremor.
Yeah.
Individuals will chew it before interpersonal stress. I have
Yeah.
attorneys that chew it before litigation or daily to help to manage
Yeah.
blood pressure.
Right.
And this is a great like 3 o'clock or 7 p.m. that witching hour when we're dealing with cravings. It's like a
Mm.
calorie free glass of wine. It takes off that anxiety that we try to quill with
Yeah.
food for that dopamine,
Yeah.
and it helps us feel safe and grounded. And so, there's various formulas like that. We have a line of probiotics. We have Calm and Clear is my desert island supplement, which gets you parasympathetic, with phosphatidylserine and also L-theanine in there, and
Yeah.
then B vitamins and nervines
Yeah.
and adaptogens.
Yeah.
So it's a cool line. It is pharmaceutical grade, we can say
Yeah.
that. So made to the same standards, GMP, triple
Yeah.
facilities, and super proud of it. And it's called
I love
Naturally
it.
Nourished.
I'm gonna put that in the show notes too. And it's funny you were saying GABA because I've been taking GABA for a couple weeks now, and it is my glass of wine, and it stopped me from drinking as much as I was because of
Yeah,
like, I'm running a business with like 13 employees. It's stressful. I
get
get
it.
off. I'm like, oh, I want that glass of wine. And instead I have like a chew, and it's like I call it my chill pills. It just
Yeah.
really like chills me out and
And
like gets me into like more relaxed, way more
it's a
relaxed.
good circuit board switch, I say, especially for
Totally.
parents. So when you're
Yeah.
trying to go from that entrepreneur executive into
Yeah.
dad,
Yeah.
and you actually want to be present,
Yeah.
it's really helpful to just kind of leave that stuff there and then
Yeah.
move on.
Love
Mhm.
it. Well, I'm gonna put a link in the show notes. How can people get more information from you? Are you taking on clients? Like, what does it look like to work with you? All that stuff.
Yeah, so I have a virtual clinic, myself and my clinical partner, Becky, who's my podcast and YouTube co host.
Shout out
So you
Becky.
can check out podcast and YouTube under Naturally Nourished.
Hmm.
And then Allie Miller RD is the Instagram and Facebook and website. And the website has protocols on it. It has, like I said, those categories
Yeah.
to support the shopping experience and some virtual programs as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna link it all in the show notes. Thank you so much for hopping on.
Thanks, Dylan.
Obviously you're a big deal. You've been doing this for a while. I don't know why you came on this podcast. I'm just kidding. Thank you so much. But
My
no,
pleasure.
it was really an honor to have you on. So thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. My pleasure. Take care.